Royce Gracie, the man who changed fighting forever. There is a moment in November 1993 that every serious martial artist on the planet should have to sit with before they ever step onto a mat or into a cage. A 176-pound man in a white GI walks into an octagon in Denver, Colorado. Around him are kickboxers, wrestlers, sumo fighters, and boxers, every one of them bigger, most of them more experienced in actual combat, and all of them completely certain that whatever this skinny Brazilian kid in pajamas was about to do, it wasn't going to work against them. By the end of the night, every single one of them was wrong, and the sport of fighting would never be the same again. But here's the part that almost nobody knows. That skinny kid in pajamas was never supposed to be there. The greatest fighter in his family, a man his own brother openly said was 10 times better than him, was the obvious choice. And the family chose the smallest one on purpose. Because the whole point wasn't to win. The whole point was to prove something. And you can only prove it the right way, if the man doing it looks like he shouldn't be able to. This is the story of Royce Gracie. And it starts long before Denver. Helio Gracie was a small man who learned Japanese jiu-jitsu as a young man in Brazil and discovered very quickly that the techniques didn't work for him, not because he lacked skill or dedication, but because the art was built around strength and leverage ratios that his body simply couldn't generate. A larger, stronger opponent could nullify almost everything he tried, and rather than accept that limitation and move on, Helio Gracie did something that would change the history of human combat. He rebuilt the art from the ground up, threw out everything that required strength to work, kept everything that required intelligence and leverage, added a ground-based philosophy centered on fighting from your back, controlling distance, and submitting opponents through joint locks and chokes that didn't care how much the other person weighed or how hard they could punch. He used to say, "Give me the right leverage, and I'll lift the world." He wasn't being poetic, he meant it literally, and the proof was in every challenge match the Gracie family took for decades. Any style, any size, any background, show up at this address if you think you're tough. They were not trying to put other martial arts down. They were trying to find out if their own system worked, and they kept finding out that it did. The Gracie Challenge became the backbone of the family's identity. You could not teach something you hadn't proven. You could not claim your art was effective without testing it against someone trying their hardest to prove you wrong. Rorion Gracie, Royce's oldest and most business-minded brother, understood that the Gracie Challenge in Brazil was powerful but limited. To truly expand jiu-jitsu, it needed to reach the United States. So Rorion moved to America and started figuring out how to get eyeballs on the art. He rebranded the challenge. Matches as Gracie and action tapes recorded. Fights where challengers from any background could bring money. Rorion would match it, and they would simply fight. The tapes spread through martial arts communities like a quiet fire. Gyms that had spent years training in systems that looked devastating in demonstrations were watching there. Assumptions get dismantled on VHS. Guys who thought they were badass fighters were getting taken down and strangled. Taken down and armbarred. Taken down and choked. Over and over and over again by members of this one Brazilian family. Royce got his share of fights on those tapes too. Mostly early victories that sharpened him and gave him experience that would matter later. But Rorion wanted more than tapes. He wanted the whole world to see this at once, in one night, on television. And that's when he and Art Davie came up with the concept that would become the Ultimate Fighting Championship. A tournament. No rules, no weight divisions, no time limits. 8 fighters from different disciplines in a single elimination bracket, one man standing at the end. The entire format was engineered around one goal, giving Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the biggest stage possible to demonstrate that ground fighting was the missing piece in every martial artist's game. The concept was simple and brilliant and slightly crazy all at the same time. And the first question it raised was who, from the Gracie family, was going to represent the art that night. The obvious answer was Rick. It was always Rick. Royce himself had said publicly, and without any apparent bitterness, that his brother Rickson was 10 times better than him. Rickson was the physical embodiment of what a martial artist was supposed to look like. Powerful, technically perfect, intimidating in a way that went beyond the physical. Putting Rickson in that cage would have proven the art was effective, but it would have done it in the least interesting way possible. Because when a man who looks like a Greek god submits everyone he faces, the world shrugs and says, well, of course he won. Look at him. The family chose Royce instead. Deliberately, precisely because he was the smallest, the most unassuming, the least threatening looking of the candidates. If a man that looked like Rickson won the tournament, nobody outside the jiu-jitsu community would be converted. But if a skinny 176-pound kid in a white GI walked through kickboxers and wrestlers and submission fighters without really hurting any of them, just controlling them, moving them from point A to point B, and making them tap, then you had proved something to the entire world about leverage, technique, in the ground game that no amount of impressive demonstrations ever could. Royce had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The youngest boy in a family of fighters, watching his brothers and cousins win tournaments, and continue his father's legacy while he waited for his chance. He wasn't afraid. He said it plainly. If he was afraid, he wouldn't have walked into the ring. He wanted this. He had always wanted this. What happened on November 12, 1993 at UFC 1 in Denver was one of the most consequential single nights in the history of sport. His first opponent, Art Jimerson, was the number 10 ranked IBF light heavyweight boxer in the world. He had a 15-fight win streak and was preparing for a title shot against Tommy Hearns. He showed up wearing one boxing glove because he was so confident in his striking that he didn't want to break his hand on Royce's face and miss his title fight. He had been told Royce was the smallest man in the tournament and couldn't punch. He had not been told that Royce was a phenomenon. Within moments of the fight starting, Royce took him down, mounted him, and held him in a position Jimerson had no framework for understanding. No submission was even necessary. Jimerson tapped out from pure psychological overwhelm. A top 10 professional boxer quit without a single punch being thrown. The crowd sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just watched. The semi-final against Ken Shamrock was the fight that everyone who knew anything about the ground game had circled. Shamrock was the number 1 ranked shoot fighter in Japan. He knew about submissions. He was bigger, stronger, and completely confident that a 175-pound man in a GI was not going to be a problem for him. He walked in thinking, no way can this karate guy choke me. Those were essentially his words. What he got instead was a technical masterclass that he still talks about with a mixture of admiration and visible frustration decades later. Royce absorbed Shamrock's initial aggression, maneuvered into a dominant position with a smoothness that Shamrock described as there being no resistance whatsoever. 1 second he was attacking, and the next he was in a bad spot without understanding how he got there, and then applied a choke that had Shamrock tapping 4 times inside a minute. Shamrock tried to continue after tapping. Royce leaned in and whispered to him, "You tapped. I know you tapped. Everyone knows you tapped. But if you want to continue, go ahead." The memory of that moment stayed with Ken Shamrock for the rest of his career in a way that almost nothing else did. The final against Gerard Gordo, the Dutch kickboxer who had already bitten someone's ear during the tournament and knocked out a 420-pound sumo wrestler, was almost anticlimactic by comparison. Gordo bit Royce's ear during the take. Royce looked at him and said, "You're cheating," received a look back that said, "So what?" and went right back to work. A choke ended it. 3 fights. Minimal damage absorbed. No real striking exchanges. Royce Gracie was the first UFC champion in history. And the next morning, every martial arts school in America was fielding calls from students asking how to get on the ground. UFC 2 was 4 months later. 16-man bracket. 4 fights in 1 night. No gloves. No time limit. No weight divisions. Ken Shamrock was unavailable, fighting in Pancrase in Japan, so the rematch would have to wait. Royce dispatched his first opponent, Minoki Ichihara, with a lapel choke in the opening round. His second opponent, Jason DeLucia, had actually fought Royce before, on one of the Gracie in action tapes, where he had been submitted in almost the same fashion. He came back hoping for different results. He broke his leg in the first 2 seconds of the fight on a sidekick attempt, and Royce submitted him with an armbar before he could fully process what had happened. The semifinal against Remco Pardoel went 91 seconds, and then came Dan Severn. Dan Severn was one of the most decorated wrestlers in American history. 3-time All-American, close to 100 state, national, and international titles and records. He had walked through his previous 2 opponents in less than 3 combined minutes without breaking a noticeable sweat. He was bigger than Royce, physically dominant on the ground, and had a wrestling base that made the usual jiu-jitsu entry points considerably more complicated. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who made reckless mistakes. And he took Royce down almost immediately. What followed was 15 minutes of one of the most psychologically intense grappling battles ever recorded. Severn used compression techniques, drove his chin into pressure points, threw punches that landed cleanly into Royce's ribs, and maintained top position for extended periods while Royce maneuvered, survived, and waited. The commentary team had essentially written Royce off. His father Helio was cage-side with the towel in his hands, repeatedly raising it and then lowering it. The conflict between a father's protective instinct and a coach's obligation to let a fighter find his way written all over his face. Royce looked up at him during the fight with an expression that said, "I'm still here. Don't throw it." Dan Severn, to his credit, was also struggling. He knew how to maintain position. He had no idea how to finish, and Royce could see that in his eyes. The moment Severn made his mistake, exposed his neck in a way that opened the triangle, Royce was already moving. A submission that Severn had never seen before ended the fight. When they stood up, Severn embraced him and said, "You are the toughest man I have ever won against." Royce Gracie was a 2-time UFC champion, the first and only man to win 2 UFC tournaments, and the fight had gone on so long that the final submission got cut off from the pay-per-view broadcast, meaning most fans didn't see the ending until the VHS tape came out. He demanded tougher competition. He got it. UFC 3 brought Kimo Leopoldo into the picture, a 250-pound man who carried a wooden cross into the octagon as part of his ring entrance, roided to the absolute limit in an era with no testing whatsoever, with no particular technical sophistication but the kind of pure physical strength that made technique considerably harder to apply. Royce made the mistake of trying to match strength with him. The fight lasted nearly 5 minutes and left Royce exhausted, dehydrated, and barely functional by the time it ended. He submitted chemo, but the cost was enormous. When it came time for his next fight in the tournament, he couldn't see. Everything went black. He told his corner he was ready, and they saw his eyes and threw the towel. Ken Shamrock, who had torn through his side of the bracket, withdrew from the tournament when he heard Royce couldn't continue. He said he didn't want to fight anyone else. He had come back to the UFC specifically to get his rematch with Royce, and if Royce wasn't going to be there, then the night had no point. Steve Jenham, a tournament alternate, won UFC 3 by default. Both men went home without resolution, and the rivalry between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock became one of the defining, unresolved tensions in early MMA. UFC 4 was Royce's answer to every question the Kimmo fight had raised about whether he still had it. He came back 3 months later with something to prove and methodically worked through his bracket. Ron Van Cleef, a 51-year-old martial artist who had been training longer than Royce had been alive, was first a quick choke. Keith Hackney, a hard-hitting karate fighter who landed a legitimate right hand that left knuckle marks on Royce's forehead, was next. Royce absorbed the punch, clinched, and finished with an arm, and then Dan Severn again in the final, with history between them. In a fight that went 15 minutes and ended with a triangle choke that neither of them had expected to be the finishing move, Royce Gracie became the first 3-time UFC tournament champion. The sport had moved on from his first 2 wins, and he had reminded it exactly who he was. The Ken Shamrock super fight at UFC 5 should have been the moment that resolved everything. Instead, it became the most frustrating entry in one of MMA's most compelling rivalries. The UFC added a time limit the day before the fight, the first time limit in UFC history, specifically because they couldn't afford to go over broadcast time the way the Dan Severn fight had. There were no judges, so a finish or a draw were the only possible outcomes. What actually happened was Ken Shamrock spending the majority of 36 minutes lying on top of Royce without doing anything while both camps and both fighters argued about who was winning and who was stalling. Shamrock landed one genuine punch in the extended overtime period that blew up Royce's eye. The fight went to a draw. Both men immediately and aggressively claimed victory. The crowd hated it. Neither man got the ending they came for. And Royce, who said that if he had an hour, he would have finished Shamrock, retired from no-holds-barred competition to start a family. He spent 5 years teaching jiu-jitsu and raising his children. When he came back, it was in Pride in Japan. And the opening round of the 2000 Grand Prix was fine. A dominant 20-minute fight where his opponent never touched him once. But then came Kazushi Sakuraba was one of the most brilliant and creative fighters Japan had ever produced. He had also built a specific and very deliberate reputation for fighting and defeating members of the Gracie family. He beat Royce's brother. He beat his cousin. He broke Renzo's arm with a kimura in front of a live audience. The MMA community had started calling him the Gracie Hunter, and he embraced it with a cheerful, almost playful energy that made the whole thing both more impressive and more maddening for the family. When Royce was entered into the tournament, there was a clear understanding within the Gracie camp that he was the one who needed to go deal with Sakuraba once and for all. What followed was 90 minutes of fighting, the longest MMA fight in history, a record that still stands and will almost certainly never be broken. Royce came in and fought hard, but Sakuraba's combination of technical creativity and physical pressure was relentless. Late in the fight, Sakuraba landed kicks to Royce's shin that cracked the bone and tore the ligaments. Royce told his brother and his father that he could get up but he couldn't walk, and asked them what to do. They threw the towel. It was the first official loss of Royce Gracie's professional career, and it happened in the 91st minute of a fight. He continued competing. A draw against Yoshida in 2003, a submission win over a 500-pound Akebono in what was honestly a spectacle rather than a serious fight. Another draw against Tokoro. His record stood at 13-1-3, and the sport had evolved enormously around him during those years, which made it all the more surprising when the UFC came calling with a fight against Matt Hughes. Matt Hughes was not just the UFC welterweight champion. He was widely considered the best UFC champion to that point in the promotion's history, a world-class wrestler with legitimate submission skills and the kind of physical conditioning that represented everything the modern era of MMA had developed in the years since Royce had first shown the world what grappling could do. The fight at UFC 60 was framed as old school versus new school, original champion versus current champion, the man who started it all against the man who represented where the sport had arrived, and it was genuinely painful to watch. Hughes used his height and reach on the feet to keep Royce away, landed clean strikes, and when the fight did go to the ground, was physically dominant in a way that made Royce's usual positional maneuvering nearly impossible. The ground and pound was systematic and controlled. Royce had no answers. He lost in the first round. And to his credit, he didn't make excuses. He said he simply wasn't there, that he was the one who didn't show up. But he came back, one more time, for In 2007, in a 3-round rematch, Royce controlled the grappling exchanges with far more authority than he had in their first meeting and won a decision. It should have been a clean ending to that chapter. Instead, the post-fight drug test came. back showing a level of anabolic steroids in his system that by any measure was extraordinary. The victory was overturned to a no contest. Royce argued that his weight at this fight versus his weight at UFC 1 proved nothing had changed. The numbers didn't support that argument. The win was gone, and with it went any clean resolution to that rivalry. He spent years after that teasing a return, giving interviews where he said he had one more fight in him, letting the question hang in the air at every public appearance. And eventually, in 2016, the opponent who provided the excuse to come back was Ken Shamrock. 23 years after UFC 1, two men in their 50s fighting in a promotion that existed on the outer edge of the sport's attention. It should have been the ending both their stories deserved. A conclusive, definitive, emotionally satisfying conclusion to a rivalry that had carried so much weight for so long. Instead, it ended in a low-blow controversy that left both men claiming the other had acted dishonorably, with Royce claiming the groin shot was intentional because Shamrock knew he was losing, and Shamrock accepting the win while the crowd sat in uncomfortable confusion. The rivalry between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock ended the same way it had always found a way to avoid ending without resolution, without the clean moment either man had been chasing since 1993. But none of that is how Royce Gracie should be remembered. And at the 10-year anniversary of UFC 1 in 2003, the sport made sure of it. He was the first inductee into the UFC Hall of Fame, alongside Ken Shamrock, his rival, his foil, the man whose career was as intertwined with his as any two fighters in the history of the sport. And the words used to describe what Royce Gracie had done were not the usual promotional language. They were genuine. He kickstarted the entire sport of mixed martial arts. He will always go down in history as one of the most important figures in martial arts, if not the most important figure. This sport does not exist without him. Here is what the record will never fully capture about Royce Gracie. Every ground fighter who has ever competed in a professional MMA fight traces their path back to that night in Denver. Every person who walked into a jiu-jitsu gym after watching a skinny Brazilian kid make a professional boxer quit without being hit. Every single one of them is part of a ripple that Royce set in motion. The submission, grappling revolution. The understanding that the ground is where fights are actually decided. The entire philosophical foundation of modern mixed martial arts. All of it flows from what one family proved over decades of challenge matches, and then what one man demonstrated in 3 fights on one night in November 1993. He was the smallest man in the tournament. He was wearing a He was the one the family sent precisely because he looked like he shouldn't win, and he won. And then he won again. And then he came back from the worst night of his UFC career and won again after that. When someone told him he was the original, the number one, the man responsible for putting mixed martial arts on the map, he shook his head and said he didn't look at it that way. That he was just part of it. That modesty is either completely genuine or the most perfectly constructed piece of misdirection in martial arts history. Either way, it doesn't change what he actually did. There is only one first UFC champion. There is only one man who proved to the entire world in a single night that everything they thought they knew about fighting was missing something fundamental. There is only one person who can claim to have walked into that cage in pajamas, against all of them, and walked out having changed every gym, every fight camp, and every martial arts school on the planet. And he did it without really having to touch them, just maneuvering them from point A to point B, making them uncomfortable in places they had never been, and waiting for them to give him what he wanted. That's the art his father built for small men who refused to be beaten by larger ones. And Royce Gracie carried it to the biggest stage in the world and made it impossible for anyone to ever ignore again.